Don't overthink it. It's just paint.
And welcome back to Paint Society episode number 1 on this 2-part series. In this episode, we're going to be featuring Pedro from Scorpion Paint and his project over at his shop. Now, this 91 NSX had been repainted a few times already, but it was peeling in a few different areas. So we're going to show you how to get the paint prepped and get it ready for primer and then paint. Now we can see here what Pedro's doing is he is sanding down all the dead paint. He's going to start with all of the dead paint. And what is dead paint? That is paint that is oxidized, turned white, flaking, peeling, delaminating, that type of thing. Nothing where it needs to go completely down to the bare plastic, but it basically needs to be feathered and smoothed out and removed. The top coat needs to be removed. So what he's using here is between 180 and 220 depending on how bad it is. That is the grit that you want to choose. Now, you always want to use the block first. Now, you can see what we're going to be doing is we're going to be blocking everything and then going over it with the DA sander. So here he's using a 180 to 220 grit on the block, and what that's going to do is really flatten things out. If you go and hit it aggressively with a lower grit like 180 or 220, what that will do is cause dents. Okay, so you want to use your finer grits with your DA, and what we're doing here is basically just refining it. So let's say we use 180 to 220 on that block. Well, we're going to be using 320 to 400, probably around 320, because that's going to give the primer something to bite into. And what we're doing here is that's refining that scratch by hand, because you can have the same exact grit, but if you're using it by hand, it's going to be much more aggressive than if you were to be using it by using a DA. Now, there wasn't a whole lot of dents on this vehicle itself, so Pedro's going to fix up a couple areas. So he's using a glazing putty right here, and since it's such a fine area, you don't need to go down to metal. You want to make sure though that your paint underneath is sanded with at least 80 to 180, and that's going to help the filler bite into those sand scratches and here to the panel itself. Now, if you're doing real restoration work, or you have a larger dent, something of that sort where you did a lot of metal work, you're going to have it all sanded down the metal. But for something just like this, you can go ahead and you can glaze it up, and make sure you're always blocking it out. Never take your DA right to your filler. Again, using that block, using the appropriate block to just scuff it up. So basically, when you have a car like this, what you're going to be doing is you're going around and you want to visualize and see where all the dents are first. Take a look around the car, circle them if you need to, and then you're going to fix the minor dents. Now, since this car had been repainted a couple times, those dents had already been fixed along the way since 91. All right, so what we're doing here and what Pedro's doing is just going to continue to block on the bad painted areas. So the fenders, the hood, the trunk, they all had shoddy kind of paint work. You can see over here on the hood, this is where the nozzle fits in for the windshield wiper, and it kind of built up around it, and he's leveling that all out. And then he'll continue this same technique on the whole entire hood. He'll go ahead and just completely block it out, and you're using the actual paint as a guide coat to show you where the highs and lows are. So that is a great trick. By blocking it out, you can see, well, if you have shiny paint underneath, that it's one or two things: just an area you need to sand still, or a possible low spot that might need to be filled. If it's just something small, you can use some glaze, or if it's a dent, you might need to bring out the stud puller or whatever method you're going to use to fix that dent properly. So just like he did on the trunk, he's going ahead and blocking it out, and he's using the 3M blocks here with 3M paper, and basically he's following an X pattern the best he can, the crosshatch pattern, to try to level it off. If you don't do it perfectly, it's not a huge deal, but it's a good practice to try. Once again, you're going over it with the DA sander, and the DA, if you look closely, has an interface pad, and what that basically does is that takes the cushion, or it takes the contours better because it has a cushion, and basically that softens up the scratch even more. By softening up the scratch, when our primer hits it, it's going to be able to really, smooth out a lot easier. It's not going to sink into an aggressive scratch, and after your paint job's done, you're not going to see scratches all over the place, because it essentially shrank into a much finer scratch rather than a coarser one. Now, moving along to the back side, he's going over to the quarter panels, and he had some peeling paint, so he's going a little aggressive here. He's using a 180 to just get all of that clear coat off. What you're seeing peeling usually is going to be that clear coat. You can see the tops of the door, same thing. So this is an appropriate type of block. It's a round cylinder block, and he's using it to fit into the contour of the door. And you'll see throughout the video that Pedro uses appropriate blocks in appropriate areas. And if you don't do that, what can happen is it can cause a dent, all right, or it can cause a low spot when you're not wanting to. Because let's say this car has been painted 2 or 3 times, it's got a build on it, and if you sand it inappropriately or sand it at an angle, you can put a divot or a gouge in it that will look like a dent. And the only way to get that out is just to completely smooth it back out properly and evenly. And that's pretty much why he's going over it with the whole entire the block first. Any of the panels are just basically being blocked first. You can see how well he does it. Now, over onto the doors were good. They weren't in bad condition. There was no dead paint on the lower half of the door. So what you can do is you can take your 320 to 400 and just give that a sand, which you can see here. Now, on this particular car, about, I would say 50% of the car is the door. You know, they have those nice long doors. I love this body style of this actual car. So once that's all sanded down, the good paint, let's just say the paint that doesn't need any further attention, you need to create a scratch. And what we're doing here is he's using a soft pad from 3M, and these are really, really good pads. They get into everywhere, then they hold a good cut throughout the whole entire process. You just give them a little blow if they get clogged, and they fit into little tight areas. So the areas where the DA sander, it's just not going to fit. You want to go ahead after everything is completely DA'd and just go over by hand the areas where you can't get to, and make sure everything's dull. You don't want any shiny paint. Now, after it's completely sanded, it should look something just like this. There's no shiny spots. Everything's completely feathered out, all right? And it's pretty much ready for its next step. But before that, well, this was a two-tone car, or at least a black top. And you know how the sun really fades up those tops. So what he's doing here is you can use a 320 to 400 grit. Now, it was just oxidated. It wasn't peeling or anything like that. It was just very, very dry. So it would need to be primered. A lot of you guys are going to ask, well, you primer some of the car, you don't primer some of the car, and that's where some of the confusion is going to lie, and I completely understand how that can be confusing. All right, so basically, if you're using anything between a 180 to 220 or 320 scratch, it's gonna need a primering. All right, he said he used 320 to 400 here. I might have used a little bit more aggressive, just because that's the way I am. I want to make sure it's smoother, but I trust what Pedro did here. He used a 320, and the reason why is his primer is going to be much smoother when he goes to lay it down. And since it didn't have any divots, it didn't have any cuts, he didn't need to go too aggressive. But there's different styles, different painters will tell you different things, but they're all within the same range, and they all get you the same result. So yeah, you're gonna go ahead and primer the areas that are a little bit more aggressive with the sand scratch. Like I said, the doors, they're not going to need any primer. All he did there is use a little combi where there might have been a little chip or something of that sort. Since this whole car is going to get sealed, that is the reason why we don't need to completely primer it. And remember, sealer is a thinned out primer. It doesn't get sanded. So we have a little bit of leeway. And that's the reason why I love sealer so much. And in part 2 of this video, you'll see the reason how sealer just comes into play and helps out. Now, what he did is went ahead and took as much as he could off of the car and got a full primering. Now, these panels underneath, you want to make sure they're all taped off, which they are, so that overspray doesn't come along on the other side, because a lot of these parts actually are painted and cleared underneath. They're not like new cars. They actually look nice underneath the panel. So he's going to go ahead. He'll put 2 good coats. He's using the 3M performance gun. It looks like a 1.4 since it's an orange cap. And I got to tell you, this is all that I use. This gun, I use it for about 65% of the work I do in a shop, just because it's that much easier to clean, and it's an efficient gun. You know, the tips actually last a lot longer than they say they will, and I use it day in and day out. Now, this is the wing spoiler. I actually lent Pedro my Easy Flex spoiler kit, and this is an awesome stand because you can do so much with it. And here you can see you can get to every single part of the actual spoiler itself without having to worry about painting one side and then flipping it over and that whole mess. So got all the parts all primered up, and then he moved on to the actual car. You can see the passenger side fender will receive a full coat of primer, whereas the driver's side, it just had a few areas that were bad. So you don't need to primer everything. If you guys followed my series on the Honda Civic project, the 6-part series, I did primer most of the car because that paint was in 100% worse condition than this one was. Like, the paint was flaking off. There was actually no clear coat, it was just base. So that required a lot more primer. And what the primer does is it gives you a new surface, right? So if he had just scuffed this up and put paint right on top of it, it would look good, but what would eventually happen is the paint underneath would react with the new paint, and it would just continue to delaminate and oxidize again. What the primer does is it locks down what's underneath it, and it gives you a new surface to paint. And that's the reason why we're primering these areas that are more aggressively sanded. Just think about it, primering all the bad areas on the car, right? All the areas that were bubbling, all the areas that just needed a lot more attention. You can see Pedro right here putting on a second coat. After the second coat, it's good enough. There's enough build with these primers. You could add another coat if you want, but there's not a whole lot of body work. There's not a whole lot of filling that he needed to do. He just basically needed a new surface to get this thing all smoothed out. So once that was all cured, he waited and came back. This is the next day. This is an aerosol guide coat. There's two types of guide coats you can use. You can use a powder guide coat, and then you can use an aerosol. Basically, when this hits the panel, it dries as dust. And the reason why we don't use regular paint, a rattle can paint, which you can, it takes a little bit longer and it clogs the paper, whereas this is a lot friendlier on the sandpaper. It doesn't clog it up. Sometimes if you use regular rattle can paint, you'll kind of like smear up the paper. You'll see it kind of just clog it up too easy, but this stuff is formulated to be used on for sanding. So what Pedro's doing here is kind of like the same exact thing he's been doing the whole entire process, but he's starting with a finer grit. So originally, let's say he started with a 180 before primer. Now he's getting it ready for paint. He's going with probably a 320 to 400. That's what I would do. Now, keeping in mind, he's sealing everything. So since he's sealing everything, he doesn't have to go through the steps of 320, 400, 600, 800 to smooth it out, because the sealer takes that place, right? So it's more efficient, it's quicker, it's faster, and that's how sealer really comes into play and really helps out, especially when you're in production type of environment. So he'll go ahead and he'll get this all blocked out, and the blocking just goes to help smoothing everything out, and he's looking to remove all of the black. Okay, the black is going to stay in the low spots, and then he'll go ahead and he'll just use the DA just like before, and that will create a softer scratch. A softer scratch is what paint wants. That's what base coat, that's what sealer wants, a nice soft scratch for it to fall into. Something smooth but not too fine where it's just going to peel off. So he'll follow that same process. Now here's where you can really see him sanding out. You can see he took that block and actually cut off a little bit of it, and it fits a little bit better onto that fender. And he's just blocking this out using probably a 320 to a 400 grit sandpaper and doing everything by hand. You can see in just a moment he'll go ahead and he'll change out the block to fit into that contour. That's a little bit of detail, that something I don't even do, that I learned from just by watching over on this video, that I think that can really be beneficial to a lot of the viewers, just using the appropriate block in the appropriate spot. And once that's all done, make it a habit, go over it with the DA. The DA, even if it's just the same exact grit you use to block out, it will leave a finer finish, a smoother finish. You can see everything you do in paint, it's a procedure, it's a process, it's the same exact thing. Get yourself in a rhythm. Anyone that is a teacher and has an experience will tell yourself, get yourself into a rhythm following the same procedures. Develop your procedures however they are. Your procedure, my procedure, and the guy, down the street are all going to have a different way to get there, but it should have the same exact result. And you don't have to stick to everything that we say or we teach, but take something from these videos and learn from it and do whatever works for you, because you can get the same result doing it differently. Now you can see the car is all ready for part 2, and part 2 will be getting paint on this car. And you can see it's pretty much all in a 400 grit, and it's all smoothed out. Now Pedro will just go ahead and he'll wash it all down. He'll get it all ready, and he'll get it into the booth and get it all ready for its sealer. base and clearing. And see, on the next episode, we're going to get this thing all sealed up, and then we're going to be reviewing the Segola. We have the Aqua Cap. I myself did a little bit of painting, and Pedro wrapped things up. This thing looks awesome. You're not going to want to miss it. And guys, this is Brian from Paint Society reminding you, don't overthink it. It's just paint. We'll see you guys on the next one.